Welcome back to Sabersmith. I'm Mark Leinhart, the general manager, and we are doing a video today with a local sword enthusiast. This is Adam Franti.
Franti.
I should ask you that
okay.
already. That's all right. Is swearing a problem? I don't know. We're going to keep going. So Adam is from the Lansing Longsword Guild, which we're going to have him tell us more about here soon. And he also has a master's in history and does a lot of the teaching involved with your guild. And you are a trained fencer in different types of swords?
Yeah, so the HEMA is a pretty broad umbrella. It theoretically covers anything that has a written source that describes how to use it.
And HEMA is historical European martial arts, for those of you who aren't familiar with it.
The way I approach it, at least, and this is not universal, every different HEMA club is different, but I study pretty much one text source.
Okay.
There are dozens, and there are dozens that cover things from like as small as dagger all the way up to pikes. Like the guy I study actually has a section on dagger and a section on polearms, which includes the pike. So literally the smallest thing you can have to the biggest that you can wield in one hand. But anything that has a text basis is technically could be considered covered by HEMA.
Oh, okay.
So that's the basis of what HEMA is as a overall project, is using these text sources to try to make sense of how these weapons were used.
And what time period were most of those texts from?
Between, it depends on. In the medieval era, it's probably about the late 15th century is when it really kicks off.
Okay.
So kind of the late 1400s, the mid 1400s, up until probably about the mid 17th century. And then after that, there's a lot more sort of kind of military oriented stuff, things that are oriented toward kind of a different set of weapons. So, the most text sources we'd have would be in the mid 19th century, just because anybody could write a book. There was a huge publishing industry.
Fair enough.
Fencing was still a really popular pursuit for various reasons, and there would have been, books written about pretty much anything.
That makes sense.
For like medieval swords, mostly you're looking at like the kind of the late 15th or the late 14th century into the 16th century.
Okay.
And most of those are like long swords, so swords in two hand.
And at that time, were they writing those books, those manuals about things that were being used still, or was it those weapons had kind of phased out and they were writing about something from a couple centuries before?
Both, kind of.
Okay.
So the text I studied was written in 1570.
Okay.
I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but he is following a tradition of German texts that started with a sort of semi-legendary figure. He probably lived. We don't really know much about him, but his name is Johannes Liechtenauer.
Okay.
And Johannes Liechtenauer wrote a poem, a poetic recitation, which was just sort of little couplets, little rhyming couplets in German that remind you tips and things.
Well, that's kind of neat.
Fence. And the problem with that is that it was written specifically to be obscure and hidden. So you had to know how to fence to know what this stuff was talking about. So you had to
It was not something for beginners. That was like if you already knew how to do it, it would keep you like a mnemonic that would help you remember to do things.
Mnemonic,
neat.
So the text tradition starts with that. It's called a tzedel.
Okay.
It sort of just means poetic recitation, calendar. It means any number of things. And various people involved in that culture wrote what's called a gloss. So a gloss is sort of you take the poem and you break it up into the couplets, and then you write a paragraph saying, this is what that means. This is when Liechtenauer says this is what he means. So you're going to cut here and step this way and do whatever.
Neat.
And that's the basis of German HEMA, is basically looking at those texts and the gloss and figuring out how we can physically do it and what it means when we physically do it.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of that comes from. So like my guy is studying a text source that he says is ancient, and he says this is a technique that the ancients did, and we don't do that so much anymore. But it's still the same weapons, it's still the same culture, it's still the same sort of athletic culture and intellectual culture, and everything really carries over. And then after about like the 30 Years' War, that starts diverging quite a bit. So there's the reason I'm drawn to it is because I like the intellectual side, I like the text study side as much as I like the physical side, and I like both of them quite a lot. So it's a huge hyperfixation for me that I've been going on for more than a decade now. So
cool.
Yeah, it's a ton of fun.
That's great. So how long has the Lansing Longsword Guild existed?
I started Lansing Longsword Guild with a couple of friends in the summer of 2017.
Okay.
I'd been doing HEMA for a few years before that. I started fencing in college way back in 2004, and
Nice.
then stopped, and then started again, and then stopped and started again, and then by 2014-15, I started fencing, doing historical fencing, and I moved up to Lansing to live with my wife in 2017, and that's when I started it. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Now, what is the primary focus of the guild? Do you teach people? Do you guys just, is it a club you hang out? What happens?
It's a social club where we spend a lot of time fencing for the most part. It's kind of how I look at it. I study primarily. I'm the head instructor, and I studied a text from a guy named Joachim Meyer. So Meyer wrote a text in 1570, which was a print, whereas a lot of other fencing texts prior to that, not all of them, but a lot of them were manuscripts. So manuscript is handwritten.
Okay.
It is an individual piece of art, right? It's not published. You don't publish a manuscript. It is someone drew it by hand. An artist hand painted figures in it, and these were mostly.
And then if you wanted copies, they were hand.
They were hand
copies. Yeah.
So Meyer wrote a text that he sent to a printer, and then the printer put woodblock art in it and made the printing press figures and everything specifically to sell it to people in the city. And he ended up dying before that happened.
And this is in Germany, you said?
This was he was in Strasbourg. He was a cutler, which is actually kind of, so you were walking around your shop earlier, and a lot of what you were talking about, fitting blades to different things, like that's a lot of what a cutler did.
Yeah.
They were blade makers. The cutler, he was a bladesmith. Well, he didn't make the blades, but he would do all the fittings.
Yeah.
He'd fit different blades to pommels. If you broke a sword, like a long sword, he would be able to make that into a messer for you or whatever.
Neat.
So that was his guild job. That was how he got his citizenship for the city that he lived in, was by doing that. So that was his primary job. He just did fencing as a passion, which wasn't uncommon.
Yeah.
So
now, you're saying that he was of like the merchant craftsman class then. So at that time, was that a common hobby? That would have been the equivalent, essentially, the middle class now. Was that, I know in parts of history, like the nobility might have studied it, but like the average citizen, maybe not.
By the 15th century or so, most of the Holy Roman Empire, most cities in Europe were in the empire, they were what they called free cities. And a free city means that it's the city government that controls the city and the city trade and gets to tax things that the city owns and everything. And they have what's called an imperial immediacy. So the only power higher than they are is the church and the pope, and not the pope, the emperor himself.
Okay.
Whereas there were some other cities that were like part of a duchy. So it's like you've got the city government. The city government is owned by, Duke Georg or whoever. Right?
Yeah.
Each of those cities, to defend themselves, would have had militias of the city, of the citizens.
Yep.
So if you were employed by a guild, you were part of this militia system, which meant that it was part of your job as a citizen to be trained in modern methods of war. And fencing was a way to do that really visibly. Right?
Okay.
Where like no one could say you weren't doing your due diligence if you show up at the fectual every week and kick the crap out of people. Right? So it was a really popular activity for people of pretty much any class, because almost everyone legally had to be armed. And one of the things they had to own was a sword. And that's mostly just as like a sidearm in case your pike or your musket breaks or whatever. But fencing was a really popular pursuit for people of pretty much every class at this time.
Cool.
One of the struggles I have as an instructor is that we don't have the same athletic culture, obviously, that they had in the 16th century.
Yeah.
So, Meyer would be expecting to train people who've been fencing since they could pick up a stick and never stopped. Whereas like now we start, as soon as you go to high school, you stop doing anything athletic unless you're doing track or football or whatever. Yeah. And so we get a lot of like adult students who just really haven't done anything physical for a long time, and we have to kind of rebuild that.
Yeah.
Whereas that wouldn't have been a problem in the 16th century because everyone would have fenced. Yeah. Probably anytime they would, and even if they didn't fence, they would have wrestled. If they didn't wrestle, they would have jumped over fences or swum as far as they could or whatever. It was a really intensely athletic culture.
Or they minimally would have had a farmer or something, and everything is being done manually, so you're just in a much fitter kind of shape than we are today in general. I'm a perfect example of that. Okay, well that's really cool. So does your guild have like a specific location that you meet up like at certain times, or you guys just kind of get together when you feel like it, or?
Kind of both. We meet twice a week at a couple of churches in Lansing. Getting space for it is always sort of tricky. We'd love to have a more permanent space to store everything, but we meet twice a week for a couple hours, and then occasionally we'll do something on the weekend. We'll just meet up in a park. In a couple of weeks, there is another club in Michigan has a little tournament they call Breitzelhau in early May that we're going to go down to. So
that's what was one of the other questions I was going to ask you is like, do you guys participate in any kind of competitions?
Mm-hmm. It depends on the individual.
Yeah.
I don't really compete anymore. I used to a lot, and then COVID happened, and I kind of lost the will to travel too much for it. But I have several students who compete, and I've got a few more who are like just kind of dipping their toes into it and getting into it. So it really depends on the student. I don't force anybody to do anything they don't want to do.
Sure.
But I like competition.
Especially if you
valuable.
just taught them how to use a sword.
Yeah,
definitely.
But people come with a variety of interests. So I try not to get in their way. I think of like the space that we have is a place where you can kind of freely explore and play, because I think that's the most important thing, right? Because I just said like we've lost that connection, and everybody wants to do it right, and they don't want to make any mistakes. But you have to play. You have to be able to play.
Right.
And playing is about being able to make mistakes, because that's the way you learn. And if you never make them, you're never not going to make a mistake. Right?
No. I mean, pretty much in any field of life,
yeah.
That's how you get better at anything.
Right. You just try stuff.
Yeah. If it works, great. If it doesn't, try something else.
Yeah.
Just keep going. And I've told people this a million times. We get a lot of people to Renaissance festivals that come up and they say, "Oh, I want to get into sword making or knife making, or I just started doing this, and do you have any tips or whatever?" And the number one tip that I give people is just keep going, because if that's what you really want to do, because your first knife or sword is going to be something. Your third one is going to be better than that one. Your fifth one will be a little bit better. And by the time you've made 100, it's not going to look anything like your first one. Admittedly, if it's worse, then maybe look at other hobbies. But usually that's not how it works. So, don't give up on whatever it is, whether it's sword fighting or, making swords or making knives. It just takes time, and you just kind of repetition and slowly get better at it. Whatever it is, the muscle memory or the technique or whatever it is. Are you guys specifically associated with HEMA?
Well, HEMA's not really. There's no official HEMA.
There's not somebody in charge of that.
One of the things I say all the time is there's no HEMA police, right?
Okay.
There's no institution that is in charge of anything.
Okay.
So every club potentially could be doing different things, but there are, of course, like trends within the
That makes sense.
subculture.
So if somebody is like obviously not in the Lansing area, but they are like, oh, they're really interested in this, they can just like do some searches on like HEMA and their zip code or whatever.
If you look at the HEMA Alliance,
okay,
the HEMA Alliance is a way for like clubs to get insurance and connect to various other things. But they have a club finder, so you go and just put in where you are, and it shows you where all the clubs are local to you.
Very cool.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of places where it's like a desert, right? There's no club within 100 miles or whatever.
Yeah.
But there are instructors who offer private lessons, even online at distance.
I have seen that. There's quite a few videos and things out there. There's people that want to teach you at least the basics. Yeah. So if you live in one of those dead zones where there isn't a club, maybe you learn the basics and you create a club.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big part of it too. Is just starting your own study group, starting your own club, finding a space, and just swinging things around.
Yeah. Now with that, when people are getting started, are they like, I don't know, I'm sure it's different for every group and depending, like, is the recommendation to use like the foam swords or sometimes, like little plastic ones?
I like using foams a lot because again, it gets people into the spirit of playfulness that I think is where they learn the best. But we use steel most often, and steel is steel like faders, steel practice swords, what most tournaments use and everything. And I think it's the one that has the most tactile depth, right? Yep. Like feeling feeling an edge connection through steel is going to feel very different than foam.
100%, yeah.
But there's a ton you can learn with foam. And if you spend the first several hundred hours of learning with foam versus somebody who spent only a couple hours with steel that they only get to use a little bit because it's, they're going to hurt themselves if they swing it too hard or whatever, the person doing the foam is going to be a better fencer at the end of that than the person using steel only.
Right.
And a lot of people, I think, again, it's this fear of doing it wrong. They don't want to bring in artifacts to their practice or whatever. But again, the more you practice, the more you play, the less restrictive you are with your own exploration, the better you're going to be.
Yeah.
Because you're just going to know more stuff. You're going to be more familiar with your body.
Growing up, I definitely played with the lightsabers a lot.
Of course.
And, we had, my buddy and I had some Nerf swords too. And that definitely, my parents probably let me watch Princess Bride and Errol Flynn movies and things like that a little too much. And now, hey, Mom and Dad, guess what? I run a sword company.
Yeah. And that's so true of almost everyone that I've taught, is like they have some story like that. They remember playing in the backyard with their siblings or their friends, swinging plastic baseball bats at each other or whatever. And we've all done that. And again, like the culture of the 16th century is that never stopped.
Right.
So those are everybody who wants to take it seriously and buy a book about fencing is somebody who spent their whole lives doing that before. And we break that today because the job is too important, or school is too important, or college is too important, or whatever. You just stop
whatever it
doing
is
stuff that's just fun because it's fun.
Well, I definitely highly recommend having fun hobbies, and sword fighting, is definitely one of those. Okay, so circle back. Those of you who've been, following Sabersmith for a long time, you know who we are, but we're going to end up talking about Sabersmith swords. We're going to do a little tour of our showroom and talk through some. And part of the part that's going to be kind of interesting is that we are different specialties. Mm-hmm. So like you mentioned, the faders are a very specific fencing version of like a longsword kind of, but they're kind of not at all like a longsword because they've changed through time.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on sort of how you're looking. Because so the text I study, one of the things that was popular was a civic fencing competition. Okay, and they used faders. Okay, we call them faders now. They wouldn't have called them faders then, but they're blunted training swords that are made to be safe in that environment. Right. So you're not trying to kill each other, but you are trying to hit a bleeding wound on the top of their head.
Oh, was that the goal then?
That was the goal.
Interesting.
They were made so the steel is very flexible. Yep. There are techniques in the book I study that assume that you can throw a cut with the flat and it would bend in. Yeah. Right. And not because that's not going to kill anyone. Right. But it is something where if you hit somebody, you slap somebody in the ear, they're going to know. Yeah. They're going to react, and that's the point, right? Because the point is get them to react to me. Based on their reaction, I'm going to hit them where they're not. That kind of thing. Interesting. So there are all sorts, right? Yeah. And Meyer himself was a cutler, so he potentially could have just cobbled these things together on his own, and he made his own. Right. And every maker in every different city would have had different kind of culture of their different types of training swords and whatnot. But we do know that they did use foiled training swords in the 15th and 16th centuries for various reasons. Obviously, modern swords are made for modern purposes, and they're modern tools made to modern specifications, so they are different. Yeah. But the characteristics are similar, right? Yeah. The dynamics are similar. Like you can get a modern-made steel fader to feel like a real quote unquote, an authentic, a sword that is used to kill someone, right? Yeah. And I have a fader that's matched to a sharp. Neat. And the sharp is actually more flexible in the blade than my training sword is. Interesting. Yeah. That's so cool. Swords can be literally anything. Any sort, you probably know more than I do about it. That's all right. Yeah. They are individual pieces of work. They're individual, to a large extent, they have to be fitted in a very custom way. But yeah, so modern HEMA, that's what we use, is these sort of modern tools that replicate the movement dynamics of historical swords. Yeah. Or try to. Yep. Well, and so one of the things that gets brought up a lot is we get a lot of people that ask whether we can make dull steel training swords, and what we kind of give mixed answers to this because it depends on who's asking, what do they want to use it for, etc. Because our goal is to build a fully functional battle-ready sword. But what that would mean is if you actually needed to grab a sword to go fight for real, we're building that sword. That's the goal.
And then we commonly get people that'll ask us like, "What's your slogans?" Like "Beyond Battle Ready" is what you know. But part of that is that not only do we build that fully functional sword as the base, but we also try to take it to like an artistic level because we are building them in the 21st century. They are for fun.
Yeah.
99% of these are being bought by collectors or sword enthusiasts that are hanging them on the wall or every once in a while going in their backyard and doing fruit ninja or tatami mat cutting or whatever.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that not only are they technically that core is functional, but also they look cool because why not? Why wouldn't you want your sword to look
break
cool?
Instantly?
Right.
You know?
Yep. So all of our swords, you probably already know this, but if you're just finding us for the first time, they're all 1075 high carbon steel. They're all full tank construction. They're all heat treated, edged, meant to be a fully functional sword. We do lifetime guarantee them against anything a sword is actually meant to be able to do. But if you need to go chop down a tree, we're not going to give you a free sword. There's a reason Paul Bunyan didn't have a katana.
Right.
It's probably a lot of reasons. But we are going to be doing some cutting demonstration videos over the course of this summer. And we are going to try to reach out to Adam and some of his friends, as well as possibly look into some local Japanese martial arts groups or whatever, and bring in some different people and to do some of these videos with us. Because although we are professional sword makers, it'll be good to have some skilled sword fighters as well to do some of these videos with us. And we are looking forward to that. As far as the training swords, I am considering adding like a couple specific pieces into our line that are specifically designed for training. And I don't know whether it'll be something that fits into your world with like the German longsword or whether it'll be something completely different. The topic has just been being brought up in 2025 and we're discussing it, and very early days. However, for those of you who are interested in that, maybe sometime soon, we'll see. But there are lots of options out there. If that is that is specifically what you want, there's lots of options out there. And maybe we'll throw our hat into the ring in the next coming years. But for the moment, train and then get your real one so you're ready, for whatever comes. So with your knowledge of the, it seems like the kind of German inspired longsword fighting is your primary specialty.
Yeah.
So do you guys also train with other types of swords like rapiers or
pretty much anything? So the text source I study covers longsword, a weapon called a dussack, which is probably more like a cutlass, like a pirate cutlass, right? It's just a complex hilt with a curved sword or a curved blade. It came from like Bohemia and the Ottoman Empire and whatnot. So longsword and the dussack and the rapier, and then dagger, wrestling, and then polearms. So staff, halberd, pike is what Meyer taught.
Nice.
Various other, there's all sorts of stuff, but I study just about anything. I primarily do Meyer, but I like rapier. I like rapier and dagger. I like sword and buckler. I like messer. I like various other, all sorts of stuff. So,
nice.
But that's just one text source. That's one club. Anyone who shows up at my club, I tell them, bring whatever you want. We'll play with it. Because, again, I don't want to get in anybody's way.
Sure.
But there are different theories, there's a different intellectual culture in different regions. So like,
oh, interesting.
Meyer teaches what he calls a rapier in 1570. And most people kind of looking at the history of swords would say that it's a little early for a rapier. That's what's called a side sword.
Right.
Right. And there is no historical basis for that term, side sword. It's a distinction we make because of intellectual inertia, because people saw a rapier and they said, oh, a rapier thrusts. So if you're teaching rapier, it has all these cuts, it must be something different.
Right.
It isn't different. It's just taught slightly differently.
This is something we've run into a lot over the years, especially at the festivals, is that we'll get people that will look at what we make and they're like, oh, that's not a blah, it's a blah.
Right.
I am very clear. We use historical, actual weapons. My poor wife, every time we go to a museum, I go through every area of the weapons and armor and, take photos anytime I'm allowed. We were in Paris, went to the Musée de l'Armée, which is a huge weapons collection. And I don't even know how many hours I was in there.
Yeah.
So, but we just use that as inspiration to build our own work. So we do not try to replicate things to a specific, pattern. or time period, because the swords also changed a lot over time, or region. I'm sure in one area of Germany, even during the same decade, and a different region, their swords were different. And so with that, we just be aware of that if you have in your mind, like you say, rapier and side sword, we make a sword that we call the side sword, because our rapiers are a certain length, and we get people like, oh, those should be 6 inches or 8 inches longer. I'm like, sure, many were, but not all. And we do ours with an edge, because I joked about this earlier, but like, let's say Zorro or something, I watch too many movies where even though it's a thrusting sword, you could still slice. You might not cut someone's arm off, but you could
in
shallow
1608,
cuts.
there's an Italian writer named Nicoletto Giganti. He wrote 2 books on fencing. One of them we didn't have for a long time, and somebody finally found it and translated it.
Oh, cool.
But one of the things he says in the 1608 book, his later book, is that since most men don't know how to fence, they use a lot of cuts. So like the text of those rapier sources are suggesting the thrust because of artistic reasons, because it's faster on a single line. You know, I can explain it in as much detail as you want, but
it's the best option for
this
actual
movement, but
sword
that doesn't
fighting.
mean everybody's going to use it all the time.
Yeah.
People cut constantly because you just cut when you have a sword, and a sword should be able to cut, and rapiers could cut, and they knew that at the time. And so a lot of this is what I mean by intellectual inertia, right? You get people looking at it and say, he only teaches thrust, so that's the only thing I'm ever going to worry about. And if you start that way without the athletic background of just knowing how to fence and being able to play with it, it makes a big difference in kind of how you look at it. But yeah, a rapier should be able to cut, in my opinion. I think so.
and that's the route we've gone.
Yeah.
But again, there's people that disagree. I did fencing in college. I was always I enjoyed it, but I wasn't ever very good. But foil and épée are hit with the tip only. Right. And that was so backwards in my mind that finally I did okay when I switched to saber, because then I could, cut and thrust. And you usually scored points on a thrust. But you had that option, which I liked. So I did have a couple other questions that I have written down. But do you have just a favorite weapon?
It changes almost all the time. Every couple of weeks I get into I've probably put more hours into longsword than anything.
Okay.
When I originally started, what I wanted to do was rapier. Was like, because I when I started, my opinion was, of course, this is just a linear evolution, right? They get better over time, and that's not at all the case, right? Things don't, they're complicated. They're really complicated.
One of my other questions was weapon historical evolution versus armor versus enemies.
Yeah.
Because they've changed.
And the culture changes, and what's fashionable changes, and what people are capable of, like production, like industrial capacity and production capacity changes as a result of all sorts of things. So,
the quality of the metals.
Yeah.
During the Bronze Age, swords usually were smaller, because if you tried to make a 3-4 foot sword out of bronze, it didn't hold up great.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I probably have done, I've certainly done more fencing at like competitions with a longsword than anything else, but that also is the culture of HEMA. That's the most popular weapon in HEMA right now. I like the Dussack a whole lot.
Okay.
And the Dussack was, in the 16th century, sort of considered to be kind of like a kid's weapon. Like this is what like teenagers and youthful people who kind of want to get a heads up on the art, they use a Dussack. And that, from Meyer's perspective, teaches the fundamentals of every weapon you can use in one hand. So that's dagger, that's rapier, that's literally anything else. You start with a Dussack. And I think right now my favorite is probably the rapier with or without a dagger on the offhand. I actually run a tournament every year. It's called Four Openings Rapier Tournament.
Okay.
And we do that in September. It's just a rapier tournament. We do, it's sort of a graduated kind of thing. You start the first half is just rapier alone, and then the people who do well at that go on to rapier and dagger, and then compete for the top spot.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So this is something that we run into a lot with our collectors or people that are just getting into being interested in swords. Very commonly, they're getting interested because they saw some really cool movie, TV show, or video game.
Yeah.
Right. So when people have these misconceptions or preconceptions, let's not call them misconceptions, of like, oh, this is how sword fighting is, or this is what a sword should look like, or whatever in movies or from that. then come to actually sword fight,
Mhm.
how does that affect
Most
things?
people like realize it's different.
Yeah.
They know it's different when they come in. I have had a couple of people show up and were like clearly disappointed that like I wasn't going to suddenly pivot from teaching Myers, which I've been doing for years, into teaching like kite shield and arming sword, because
Yeah.
one, we don't have any texts for that. Two, I'm not an expert at that. And three, no one else is interested in it right now either. But I do tell them, you know, if you have an interest, like bring it. And I
Yeah.
guarantee you'll have somebody to play with at the very least.
Right.
And that's where it starts, right? And
Yeah.
that can become a study group, and that can become its own thing. And in 3 or 4 years, we might have like the kite shield and arming group guys. You know,
Yeah.
who knows? But for the most part, people understand movies or fiction and their storytelling more than anything else. They understand that like you're not going to be coming in and doing spinny moves and blasting people with signs from The Witcher. Like
so him saying that most people know this is from his experience at the Lansing Longsword Guild.
Well, these are the
this
people
is not necessarily our experience at the Renaissance Festival.
These are the people who've been through they've been at the booth at the Ren Fair, right? And they've gone through a process already of deciding this is something I'm going to commit
I'm actually interested enough to follow through on it. Yeah, that's fair.
It's a lot easier to come by and just say whatever you want at a Ren Fair booth and then move on.
And the thing is, I would love to be able to say yes to a lot of times when people reach out. Like I play video games. I read an absurd amount of fantasy and historical, fiction and stuff like that. Constant. I have earbuds in, listen to audiobooks almost all the time. My poor family, has to deal with that. So, I would love to be able to say yes every time somebody's like, hey, can you make me this 7-foot sword from this video game? Be like, that would be really cool. Sadly, physics exists.
Right.
And so even though we are not constrained as sword makers, we are not constrained specifically by trying to replicate an exact thing. We still there's a limit, for, in our case, like one simple limit is our kiln to heat treat is only so big. And, that's one of the reasons I don't have Zweihanders or Flambeurs at the moment, because at some point here, I want to build a larger kiln and then I'll be able to heat treat something that big and then boom, then I'll have them.
Right.
But in the meantime, I cap out a certain height and a certain width and whatever. But yeah, it's interesting, also some of the misconceptions. I had a gentleman who was very upset after buying katana because he thought he could slice through like a tree in a single swing.
Yeah.
And I was like, where did you get that concept?
Even if the sword's capable of it.
But like a tree. Yeah. Not like a sapling or something, which I'm like, okay. But that's actually why we now like our example when we tell people like, these can do anything a sword can do. But if you want to do something in your backyard, like chop a tree down, they aren't built for that. And that's the example, is because of this one guy who he was so disappointed that like it didn't work that way. And when we finally dug into it, it's because like he had seen so many anime.
Yeah.
And they like run through forests, and like bamboo is one thing, but like they're just he's like slicing through a tree trunk in a single swing and should be able to do that. I was like,
not quite.
not quite. That's not quite how it works. But I mean, with the proper sword and proper technique, like the tatami mat, we use that term a lot. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, that is, I believe, came from Japan or Asian countries in general, but essentially like rolled up rice or bamboo matting that when you soak it in prepare it in a certain way, then you can use it for cutting, and it gives you a similar effect to like cutting through.
The way I always explain it to my students is it's not a medium that's like replicates flesh, but it gives you feedback, because based on how you can cut, and then you look at the cut, and if it's perfectly straight, then that means that was a really good solid cut. But then if it curves this way, then okay, you probably hit with a different angle or whatever, we can make an adjustment next time, correct, right?
Cool.
So it gives you a medium through which you can examine what went wrong and how to tweak it so it'll be better next time.
Yeah.
And tatami's great just because it is layers and layers and layers. So those little changes of speed, or if you hit with the tip or whatever,
your edge angle,
we can look at it and we can say, this is what
went wrong, or what happened.
You contacted this way rather than this way or whatever. So it gives us a medium that we can use to examine and analyze and improve. Whereas like a milk jug, you can't really.
Yeah, pool noodles is another one.
A pool noodle
gives you
right?
more details than like just a water bottle.
It gives you different details. Yeah, and so it's that's one of the reasons that tatami is really popular.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like it replicating anything, but it does give you a way to really analyze the cut.
Yeah, I mean the big replicate we'll get occasionally when people ask is like, can we get like the ballistic gel dummies? And I'm like,
I've done some cutting on pigs.
Have you?
Pig carcasses.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I looked into the ballistic gel thing before, and it's not. It's very expensive.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. And so like that doesn't mean we won't ever do it, but if we do, it'll be occasional. You know, the tatami mat's not cheap even.
No.
And you literally buy this and then chop it up, and that's one that. So we will probably also be doing videos with, you know, pumpkins and watermelons and stuff like that, which is just fun.
Especially if you get around like early November.
Yeah.
You can get a lot of pumpkins really cheap.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we actually used to do a live action Fruit Ninja demonstration at one of our festivals. And the like last thing we would do is we'd have like one person on either side throwing a coconut back and forth and slicing a coconut in half out of the air. Always reminds me of Robin Hood, or I'm sorry, of Peter Pan in Hook. Robin
you ever
Williams.
get it to spin on the table?
Oh yeah. You just feel like you're like, oh yes, peak.
Yeah.
Like I have won in life now. But yeah, we'll be doing some of that content for you guys moving forward, because I know we make these claims of like this is the quality of our swords, and you're like, well, prove it. It's like, okay, well, this is not ancient Japan where I'm going to use like prisoners or something to like test the swords out, and sadly we don't have an unlimited budget to buy like pig carcasses. How did that come about? How did you end up doing that?
It's an event run by the Meyer Fry Factor Guild, which is sort of an umbrella group that studies Meyer. Every year they had an event at a like family farm out in Iowa.
Interesting.
And they just had a pig carcass. So a couple of times, like, people will make specific purchases for it too.
Interesting. I'd have to look into that.
There's quite a big subculture within HEMA of people that do test cutting competitions and whatnot. So there's a big sort of infrastructure for it within HEMA.